Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Ike's Political Minute. Today, or more precisely, yesterday, we have breaking news. It appears that Russia is devolving into civil war. I think that Wikipedia here actually explains it best when it says that on June 23rd, 2023, forces loyal to Yevgeny Prigozhin's Wagner Group began a mutiny against the Russian government, citing the Russian Ministry of Defense's and namely the Russian Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu's mishandling of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as well as claiming the Russian army shelled one of the Wagner Group's barracks, resulting in casualties. Wagner occupied the city of Rostov-on-Don, surrounding and then seizing the headquarters of the Southern Military District. Prigozhin has vowed to march on Moscow and arrest Shoigu and other Russian generals and put them on trial for the murder of the Wagner personnel. This is huge. Russia has never had such a tumultuous change in power since 1989. And sorry, by the way, in case I butcher a whole bunch of the pronunciations throughout this video. And there are so many different ways that this civil war could go, or even just a mutiny. President Vladimir Putin, according to CBS News, has vowed Saturday to defend Russia against an armed rebellion by mercenary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin, who led his troops out of Ukraine into a key city out of Moscow, Rostov-on-Don. And I've marked right here, most of Russia is under Putin's control, except for the Rostov Oblast, which I have colored blue, which is currently being occupied by Yevgeny Prigozhin. However, I think that a lot of Russia could revolt, even as Putin remains strong. Now, as I'm going to explain later in this video, I think that Vladimir Putin will remain strong in the central area of Russia that is economically prominent, the area where Russia has most of its population and most of its controls. And as I'm going to get into later in this video, I think that that's because most of the elites, they certainly aren't a fan of Putin. They aren't a fan of how the war has gone, but they would actually see Yevgeny Prigozhin as even more radical and even more crazy than Vladimir Putin. So yeah, I think that Putin would have a pretty strong influence in this area of Russia. However, I think that we need to go over into the areas of Siberia and in the Caucasus where there are a lot more ethnic groups that have generally felt oppressed by the Russian Federation. Ethnic groups like the Chechens, ethnic groups in the Altai Mountains, or in Irkutsk, or in Chutka, areas where basically Russia has exerted a lot of influence on these ethnic groups, made them feel like they don't have as much influence or control, and all of a sudden, with Yevgeny Prigozhin's mutiny, they could feel the power they need to fight back, the power they need to assert their own independence and control. So I think that, just like that, Russia could see a lot of its Siberian territory defect and go to Prigozhin, so I'm just going to fill that out right here. I think that it would be a ground war, and even though it wouldn't be fair necessarily to look at it this way because a lot of Russia's population is concentrated in the east, I think that Prigozhin would do really well in Siberia just because that's where a lot of non Russian ethnic groups are. So I'm just going to fill that out right here. Yes. Yeah, and I mean, it looks like Prigozhin is much more successful right now than he actually is, just so you know, like, most of Siberia is actually really empty. Like, yeah, I mean, it's only when you go to the east that you actually get a lot of population and a lot of different districts. Yep, definitely the autonomous areas would be more likely to defect to Prigozhin. And yeah, I think that this is about the extent of where Prigozhin would go in Siberia. Not too much. I think that Putin's influence in the east of Russia, which is by far where most of the population is, would be pretty strong. However, this is the game changer. Rostov on Don is in the south of Russia, it's in the Caucasus. And the Caucasus is geopolitically important for many different reasons. It's close to the Middle East, it has a lot of oil. And I think that also what we need to understand is that the Caucasus also, like Siberia, has a lot of ethnic groups that generally feel oppressed by the Russians, which is why I think that Prigozhin would be able to take control of the Caucasus and also of Kaliningrad, since this is more of a satellite territory of Russia that I think would feel less of a problem with just moving away from Putin in general. So I'm going to fill out the Caucasus as favoring Prigozhin. Yep. Yeah, as you can see right here, there are definitely more people in the Caucasus, so some much smaller territories. I mean, in Siberia, some of the districts are just downright huge, but that's because there have been barely any people out there. So, yes. And actually, I mean, look, probably the takeover of Siberia wouldn't be that big of a deal, but Prigozhin taking over the Caucasus and or being able to occupy it with the help of ethnic rebels is huge. And here's why. It would lead to an oil crisis. According to The Atlantic, approximately 85% of Russian oil is produced in the Caucasus, particularly in the region of Baku, where production reaches 24 million tons. And this is huge because Russian oil is one of the main reasons that Russia has been able to withstand Russian sanctions, that it's been able to keep its economy afloat even amid otherwise disastrous prospects. And like I said before, Russia has had a testy relationship with many of the ethnic groups in the Caucasus, particularly with Chechen nationalists, with the Council on Foreign Relations telling us that Russia fought 2 wars against Chechen separatists in the first decade after the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, losing the first and winning the second. They would be instrumental in working with Prigozhin to take the Caucasus out of the Russian Federation's control. And with Russia's Caucasus lost, and 85% of their oil production now being in Prigozhin's hand, this would lead to a geopolitical realignment because they've all of a sudden lost 85% of their oil leverage. And I'm going to show you this Al Jazeera article, which shows very precisely which countries are most reliant on Russian oil, because it's interesting to see. As we can see right here, these are the countries ranked by population by just how much of their crude oil they import from Russia. We can see countries like Belarus, Cuba, Curacao, Kazakhstan at the top. And right here we can see China and India, especially, they aren't too high. But do you see what is high? Turkey, at over 50%. Turkey is a NATO ally, and at one point, Turkey did end up kind of being the mediator between the United States and Russia. They were purchasing weapons from Russia and more favorable. But now with the Caucasus lost, I think that Turkey would geopolitically align more towards the West. Because as we see right here with Turkey's Caucasus policy, in RUSI, Turkey sees the easing of tensions between Armenia and Azerbaijan as a key step towards the South Caucasus integration plan, which has been accomplished by a thaw in relations between Ankara and Yerevan. These high stakes explain why Russia and Turkey are paying close attention to the South Caucasus tensions, even as war continues to rage in Ukraine. What this shows is that Turkey values peace in the Caucasus region, and it also values the oil that it can get from there. So, therefore, it would be in Turkey's best interest, in Erdogan's best interest, to align with Prigozhin so it can keep access to Russian crude oil and generally secure peace in the Caucasus and with Chechens who have long been opposed to the Russian Federation. However, I don't think that China and India would take the same route. I think that they would be neutral because China and India, according to Al Jazeera at least, have relied on at least some Russian oil. It's been growing, and it's been a huge reason why Russia has been able to keep its economy going. However, I don't think that it would be enough for them to simply turn against Russia just because they need Prigozhin's oil because they're huge partners with Russia. Russia could easily militarily attack them, and it would be much more dangerous since they're not NATO allies. However, this is also where I think Putin has to benefit. I think that Russian elites in this situation would back Putin. According to an article from the New Yorker, which actually was published around 1 month before we actually even knew that Prigozhin was going to declare this, back in May 3rd of 2023, it said that Vladimir Putin actually really likes Prigozhin. It said that Prigozhin had split allies, attacking pillars of the regime, such as the army, and challenged Putin's appointees, and even the presidential administration using his own armed militias and media allies. He has a more radical agenda than is usually allowed to spread through the informational space. But here's the catch. He has remained untouchable up to this point because of Putin. Quite simply, Prigozhin is radical, but not radical in a way that he aligns with the West. He sees himself as the more extreme version of Russian patriotism. He wants to go even further to restore Russian dignity as he sees it, and this would probably spook the elites even more, causing them to turn towards Putin and economically align themselves with him. I think that ultimately, China and India would end up aligning themselves with Russia, seeing it as a terrible geopolitical consequence if someone as radical as Prigozhin gets into power. But if Turkey aligns, and as we can see right here, there are 9 countries with access to nuclear weapons, we could see peace with Prigozhin falling, or nuclear war, as either Russia or another country like Turkey, India, or China launch a nuclear weapon as an easy way to get to the end. This would lead to disastrous consequences for all. Millions upon millions would die, and we could possibly see the end of the world as we know it, or at least the end of the world for a huge chunk of the world, its land or its population. We don't know how this will all go. But Americans and others lived in this kind of fear throughout the Cold War. Let's hope that those fears remain unfounded, just as they did decades ago.